Before we begin today's episode of Left Hand, I just want to give a quick shout out to all of our Patreon subscribers. Now that 2026 is fully underway and Emma and I have started to really coalesce the programming for the months ahead, we're aiming to essentially double the output of this channel alongside our broader work with building the Acid Horizon Research Commons. This episode is arriving early for all sustainers of the Left Hand podcast. And throughout the year, you'll also be getting a lot of bonus content, early releases, and extras, including our upcoming interview with Phil Ford. Lots of good things are on the horizon, as they say. But for now, let's get to today's conversation with Emma, where we debrief her recent course on acid communism and her trip to Bloomington, Indiana, where she attended the first ever Weird Academia conference. This is Left Hand, and I am your host, Sereptie, also known as Craig of the Acid Horizon podcast. I'm here with Emma in the studio today, co-hosting. This is going to be a new type of recording for us. I think somewhat in the vein of our first episode together, but Emma, over the past, well, it wasn't the weekend, it was late last week, she flew out to Bloomington, Indiana to attend the conference entitled Weird Academia, hosted by the Center for Possible Minds and Weird Studies, headed up by Phil Ford, who's actually going to be a guest on the show in the coming weeks, and we'll probably talk a little bit about that. But we were going to use this particular recording, this episode, if you will, as a chance to sort of debrief and talk about what it was like to experience an academic conference centered around the concept of the weird and how that might have differed from any other academic conference that either one of us have been to in the past. Well, at this point, I'll just give it to you, Emma. How was the trip? What were your overall impressions?
It was fantastic. I think everybody involved was treating it a bit as an experiment, something that had certain contours. And of course, there were specific things on the schedule. But I would describe it as not a traditional conference in the sense where you have people presenting on various research topics and you have panels that are often running concurrently. It was pretty small scale. There were a few official events on the schedule that included a film screening followed by a recording of the Weird Studies podcast. The following day, there was a panel that had 6 or 7 scholars presenting on the concept of weirding academia and making spaces for the weird broadly construed in traditional and non-traditional settings. And I believe the opening event was actually a gallery opening where the photographer Shannon Taggart was hosting an opening of her show on the Indiana University campus, where some of her work on seances was being shown, and there was a musical accompaniment from Michael Garfield. So there was a small number of events. Nothing ran concurrently, and then there were a few sort of off-schedule events that happened that I coordinated alongside Michael Garfield, which made it sort of 50% conference in the traditional sense, and then 50% more of a small-scale colloquium or event series, where the really special thing was that because only one thing was happening at a time, everybody was at everything or most things. So people were seeing each other over and over again over the course of the few days and sort of spontaneously then meeting up for meals, dinners, drinks at a bar. So it felt a little bit like a week of weird academic summer camp too, because it had the feeling of like everyone sort of doing the same activities and then meeting up for breakfast, lunches, and dinners together. And also the weather was so extreme. We were having routine sub-zero temperatures in Bloomington. It really affected the feeling where it was sort of like we were all fighting our way through the cold together. So there was a lot of camaraderie and bonding over that, and everyone having a strange time arriving there. So it was special, and I don't know if anything like that in its particularities will be repeated. But Yeah, I'm still processing it too, because I only arrived maybe 36 hours ago back in New York, and I'm still working through my takeaways now.
The first image that comes to mind, if you were to run a conference or a colloquium called Weird Academia, is not the people who intended to attend the event, but those passersby at the university who like maybe saw the signage and then meandered their way into the auditorium. Was there a presence of people who kind of stumbled into the event and maybe had unusual questions or were perhaps surprised at the content of the conference?
A number of people at everything, every discrete talk or film screening or what have you, were students or faculty from Indiana University who had heard about it through some channel, maybe Jacob Foster or Phil, who both teach there, let their students or colleagues know. But just as much, maybe seeing a flyer around campus or even seeing a few people gathering outside of a space, going into something that just seemed interesting and just sort of found themselves there. And we did end up picking up these people, some of whom eventually wound up going out to have a beer with us or having a meal with those who had been planning this for months. And it was interesting to see how different people, including those who had been really doing the on-the-grounds planning. So that would be the Center for Possible Minds folks. That's Jacob Foster and Erica Cartmill. I might be not getting that name correct. Erica of the Center for Possible Minds, who's a cognitive scientist at IU, and Jacob Foster, Phil and JF from Weird Studies. And I think there were a few other core organizers. And then Michael Garfield and I were asked to help to organize some unofficial events for people who were traveling. But all of us had different ways of describing what was going on to the newcomers who had no idea what was going on. And you get 10 different versions of what is weird academia? What are the objectives of this series of encounters? Why are people here? Why did people travel all the way from Scotland, California, New York to come here for these few days? And they were all complimentary. I'm not sure that everyone walked away feeling like they completely understood what was going on. But then I think that some of us are still, like I just said, making sense of what we can carry forward from this. I mean, that there are particular objectives and goals and respective interests represented. But there was also a bigger feeling that I think we're still trying to integrate, as they might say in the psychology world.
Yeah, I mean, both you and I have at least some, if not quite a bit of exposure to the work of JF and Phil, for example, maybe even Eric Davis and the sort of the extended universe of the weird. And I mean, I can already imagine what some of the broader arcs might have looked or sounded like at the conference. But was there anything that was routinely mentioned or a kind of refrain of the conference itself, something that kept coming back again and again that you heard that might be different than what we ordinarily hear in, for example, in the Weird Studies podcast or something like that? And especially given that you have the confluence of all these people in a single space, and not to mention now there are random passersby and other students and faculty joining into the fray.
One thing that I heard quite a bit of is this sense that actually a number of academics are sort of in the closet with respect to the weird, that there are topics and methods that are not considered completely legitimate, or if you really want to pursue them, you have to do it covertly or by embracing interdisciplinarity, as so many academics have been inclined to do in the last 10 to 15 years, as a means of being experimental with your subjects and with the approach that you're taking to your subjects. The scholars and artists that were part of the panel on Thursday evening all had very different backgrounds. One of the presenters was Jeffrey Kripal of Rice University, who runs a center at Rice University, I believe called the Center for the Impossible, which is funny because at IU, they've got the Center for Possible Minds, and then there's the representation by the Center for the Impossible. And he is a scholar of religious studies, and he reflected on how he's been able to advance a very unorthodox research agenda and become very decorated, very well known as a scholar, doing quite weird stuff and stuff that would be considered probably so woo as to it would be on the new age occult shelf of Barnes and Noble and might not be taken seriously by academia. Except that he has had this very official affiliation for a long time, and he's kind of able to do certain things because he's working in the capacity of religious studies, where you can kind of filter some strange things through that lens and people accept it, even if it's not about a particular religious tradition as such, which is, as far as I understand his research, it's more about paranormal experiences, encounters that cannot be explained through any scientific framework. He's interested in really out there stuff, more so than particular religious traditions and practices. But because he's doing that in that capacity, he kind of was able to get things through, and also just by dint of his rigor and his ability to communicate at a certain level of sophistication. So he was speaking about that. Another person that was on that panel was Kat Hobader, who I believe is at St. Andrews University in Scotland, who is a primatologist and spends a great deal of time every year in sub-Saharan Africa with chimpanzees, just chimpanzee research, and comes with just very capital S scientific credentials. And it's through her research with chimpanzees and being in the field with them that she's come to the study of the weird. She spoke implicitly at that panel and explicitly in another event, I think, about how if there is greater interest in the weird, again, construed as broadly as we can construe it, things that might be considered pushing the boundaries of scientific legitimacy or the occult or supernatural, if there is a greater interest in it now than there used to be, that some of that has actually come through the study of animal consciousness and animal minds. And we keep in the theoretical traditions that Left Hand and Acid Horizon are working in, we're problematizing the human all the time. That's just standard fare. But then in a completely different part of the forest, there are scientists who have their own way of troubling our understanding of what does the concept of species even mean? How can thinking through what it means, what it might be like to be an animal, really throw a lot of very fundamental presuppositions into question? And that is sort of her way into this. And it's almost as if there's this convergence now around the weird as a container for what a greater focus on interdisciplinarity, maybe just greater access to information and greater communication networks, thanks to having now 30 years of the internet, has empowered all of these academics to really expand their horizons. And that's leading to this interest where obviously the vast majority of academics can't come out of the broom closet, so to speak, but there are a lot more of them than we could ever possibly account for. I think that was a pretty big theme.
I want to dig into, as best as you are able to, some of the contents of the primatologist talk on how she got into the weird. I mean, just at a glance, just bringing up the concept of species, for example, nothing creates a stronger conceptual firewall in some ways than the concept of species. Like right now, I'm looking out my window, like I showed you earlier, and I have about 4 deer here eating the corn that I've put down because there's about 13 inches of snow on the ground. And well, it's melted a little bit, to be honest, but just those moments where you experience a lapse of the species firewall, and you have those moments of connection after having seen the work of Jane Goodall. I mean, I can imagine something like that is happening, but I'm curious, like what the entry point was for her research and the connections she made with the weird.
She began her part of the panel by pointing out that even in the hard sciences, there's no very clear, concrete, theoretical definition of what exactly species means, what exactly the line is between life and death. And if I had heard that 15 years ago, let's say, I might think that she's speaking somewhat figuratively or embellishing to kind of make a point that would land with this generally non-hard science audience. But since I have a bit of a background in science and technology studies, and I've been quite interested in how concepts in the physical sciences become reified, I have a pretty good understanding of what she means by that is very real. Like we need taxonomies to help us organize natural life, but there are always, so each category in a taxonomy, within each layer of declension, there should be only mutually discrete categories. Like something can't be a cat and a dog at the same time. A species designation or within each declension, there shouldn't be any continuity or overlap. In reality, biology doesn't work like that. So I sort of understand, not obviously the way that actual scientists do, but I understood what she meant by that. And when you start from that perspective, I would imagine as a scientist, you're already, when you take that nebulousness seriously and you're more interested in the reality of what you're studying, in her case, natural life, animal life, you're already starting from a sort of weirded, very open-minded perspective. And I think that's why she began that way. It's like, look, even in the sciences, there's this idea that we have this fixity and concreteness, but it's largely for instrumental purposes that we just have to kind of use terms as if though they're very ironclad. And in fact, life is so continuous and so strange and eclectic that language sort of fails as to when it comes to capturing those continuities. But from there, she went on to describe interactions that she had with the chimps where she gained a certain kind of knowledge that she would not have gained if she hadn't been open to possibilities regarding animal-human communication that, from another perspective, you might just say aren't possible. She described a research project where she was very interested in seeing how chimpanzees sleep. So I suppose, and I just learned this a few days ago, that chimpanzees build nests in trees. They climb up a tree, and when they're ready to sleep, they're actually very, very particular about how they built their nests. They kind of need everything to be a certain way. And this is something that hadn't really been studied extensively. So she was on this agenda to basically observe chimpanzees building nests and sleeping. And she had been in the field for a number of days and hadn't really gotten the eyes on the phenomenon the way that she wanted to, and was sort of getting frustrated and upset with just the lack of the experience that she had wanted to have. And she was sitting at the base of a tree and was at some point just approached by a chimpanzee that, first of all, she had named. And I suppose that there are different schools of thought in in this field about whether you should name the animals. Some people say that once you give them a name, you lose your scientific objectivity because you start relating to them and developing an emotional connection. But she names them, like at least in her head, she gives them names. Is a chimpanzee who was like a 60-year-old female, like grandmother age, that she had named, who approached her and almost sort of like took her by the hand and like led her deeper into the woods and climbed up a tree and built a nest. And she had this profound sense of like, on some level, this intention or this desire of mine, or there was something about this that felt not quite as random as we would traditionally think of it as from a hard scientific perspective. And that maybe something about her openness to that and framing it in this way imbues her with a certain kind of knowledge that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. And she spoke a little bit about how different every discipline has trends, and every different geographic regions impart different biases to how they make sense of things. And this affects the sciences as well. So she says, like, bonobos have historically been studied more by like West Coast scientists, and that was going on in the 60s and 70s. And then chimpanzee research came a little bit later. And our ideas about chimpanzees versus bonobos is so deeply, deeply influenced by our biases. But I mean, I guess overall, the overarching takeaway is like, we're in communication with these species, regardless of how we want to think about it. We're doing so much translating, and we are kind of also sending out messages to these animals, regardless of what type of animal you study, that it's not legitimate to put so much of yourself into the research from a traditional perspective. But there's another sense in which not doing that is also not accounting for everything that's going on. And then all of this sort of takes you into the weird territory.
Right away, it makes me think that the distinctions that we make at the level of species, genus or species or what have you, that the collapse of those categories or the collapse of those distinctions can also lead to an entire rupture of the epistemological framework and the discipline with which we're approaching the will to gather knowledge about our world. And there is a kind of a conceit, if not an utter hubris at times, when it comes to the scientific method, to think that we can operate within constraints that we have imposed upon a particular area or object of research. And what happens? How do we then make an account of what took place during that experience? And it also makes me think that there's a kind of implicit morality within the category of the researcher itself, fraught with its own rules regarding what's in bounds and out of bounds with respect to the methods. But not only that, because that will insulate us or secure us perhaps from certain kinds of insights or ruptures or encounters. And there almost needs to be a kind of a meta-epistemology or meta-method where we make an account of what happens in those instances and not see them just merely as breaches of the method.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think about that from the perspective of philosophy, what methods are considered legitimate within the study of philosophy and theory, because this is a space where I suppose people who haven't been in academic philosophy or theory for very long might think that there is a very wide range of tools at our disposal, or that we can sort of just do what we want. This is famously the critique that's leveled at post-structuralism in French theory, that it's just sort of going in any direction whatsoever, scribbling all over the place. That actually, even in the most radical, ungrounded, as some of the critics might say, traditions, there is a sense of methodological closure that is one of the reasons that I make common cause with the weird. I don't know if I would call myself a weird academic per se, especially topically speaking. I don't write about topics that have like capital W weird over them, except maybe for psychedelics. But I always only do that within the context of like officially sanctioned psychedelic science. But I think that philosophy stands to think about itself this way as well. And Left Hand is an interesting project because, of course, it's an outgrowth of Acid Horizon. But I see this as a space where maybe that could happen a little bit, while, of course, never forsaking rigor, but being very sort of deliberate and self-reflexive about not just what is considered legitimate fare, but how we go about discussing and the doing of theory and philosophy.
Yeah, I always felt that Left Hand was a particularly safe space for my Deleuzian nonsense, in the most positive sense of the term nonsense. But yes, I guess that brings me then to another question. And first of all, you are a theorist of the weird. How can you say that just off the heels of completing the Acid Communism, a world that could be free, a world which could be free class, which, by the way, now that it is complete, if you're listening, probably within the week, I will be posting the first 4 courses in the Acid Horizon Research Commons archive. And after extreme deliberation and conversations with friends and people who've been involved so far, we're going to make those eminently accessible. We do want to make sure that the people who have done these courses are remunerated handsomely for their efforts. But in the end, too, we want to make sure that both Acid Horizon and Left Hand and the Acid Horizon Research Commons have longevity. So we'll offer those at a very, very affordable price, and probably much cheaper than you would get in some other para-academic institutions. But with that said, actually, I want to do a debrief on your course, but maybe one last question about the event. Since we are talking a little bit about acid communism in politics, you and I have had sort of green room discussions about the challenges that the concept of the weird poses to our shared political commitments. Do you think any of that was touched upon, or did you feel any kind of resonances or have any shifts in your worldview with respect to your politics and the way that you conceive of politics against the concept of the weird while you were at the conference or in the wake of it? Was there any or none of that?
I think there was a sense of a metapolitics. I think that most of the folks who were on the panel and who were part of the official events in their capacity as being scholars and artists don't want to do politics in a certain way. And to be more specific, I don't think that they want to take politics as an explicit topical concern. And I don't want to misrepresent anybody. So just I'll say that I don't know exactly how everybody thinks about this for their own career and reputational purposes, because I'm now speaking about a group that is maybe 12, 13, 14 different people, right? But I think in general, there is a sense that when you take politics as an explicit concern, you're importing so many assumptions, so many objectives, so many assumptions in particular about ethics and rhetoric, what's okay to say, what's not okay to say, that the sense is more that there's an intrinsic politics or maybe metapolitics to any kind of intellectual or creative work that's simply holding the space for and facilitating intellectual, scholarly, artistic, creative life is an affirmation of a certain kind of life. I will speak just for myself and say that at a minimum, I consider that to be anti-fascist. And Or that I'm not the only one in this broader cohort that would say that. And that simply by standing up for the intrinsic value of learning, the intrinsic value of the arts and humanities, and the interfaces between disciplines that go beyond the mere sustenance of their life by helping people get jobs or by doing technoscience in a way that underwrites capitalism, that there's something about that is ineluctably political. And I don't think that that's a super controversial thing to say. But aside from that, there's a sense, I think, and again, maybe I'm being too interpretive, that as things are going on in the world, things being what they are, I don't want to sound waffly, but like, look at what's happening in the United States right now, in Minneapolis, over the country with ICE, that part of the project of standing against that is dealing with it directly, like literally going to confront ICE if that is your inclination. And part of that is realizing that we need to preserve the things that the big evil wants to destroy. And that some of that also means sort of sheltering it and maybe not always talking about how horrible things are, just to sort of keep the kind of life going that they would prefer to have us fully distracted from. And hopefully, again, that doesn't sound equivocal. So it was not a particularly political event in the sense that I think most people would use the term political, but that's not to say that wasn't there. I do want to say one more really quick thing about this, and this relates sort of more generally to what's going on with weird scholarship and being in weird spaces, to the degree that I am a weird academic, and that Left Hand is a space where we can do this sort of thing. I am very aware of the link between intellectual experimentalism and the do your own research mindset and interests in the occult and the magical, and how they can be places for reactionary and far-right thought to proliferate insidiously and then sort of spiral out to being a bit more explicit. And it's something that I think about a lot. But I personally haven't had any big issues with like finding out that someone I'm working with is actually secretly of that bent or anything. But I guess I say that just to have it said.
Like a fascist wizard or something like that.
Look, they're out there.
I mean, yeah, I mean, this is provoking a riff within me right now, but I would say at the very basic level, and maybe even just going back to some of the things that you were saying about the metapolitics of the weird, it leads me back to a conversation that I had with Claire Colebrook maybe about 2 years ago now, where we talked about the concept of becoming dash in Deleuze's book, Becoming Woman, Becoming Child, and so forth. Becoming animal, I mean, that's right at the top of what we're talking about here today. But one of the ways that she understands that, or her translation of that concept is that the dash is really what we should focus on conceptually there. And it's within that dash that a lot of anti-fascist stuff happens. And the reason that is the dash is the point, the hinge point. I mean, linguistically speaking, it is literally the hinge between the becoming and the object of the becoming. But it's also the point at which we can create that little caesura or gap that allows us to interrogate our attachments in ways that fundamentally unsettle them. Just to flash forward real quick to the big picture, when we look at the national operation that is ICE and their aggressive program of kidnapping and the deportation of undocumented people, it's essentially all predicated on an imagined category mistake. You do not belong in this space. And so when we go back down to the micro level, to the dash, it's in the meditation upon that. And this is the thing too. I think the weird aspect of it is that often we are not as intentional as we would like to be or as we imagine ourselves to be when that interrogation is spawned. I believe, because I find the becoming dash, the way that it happens to me is that it's in a happening from the outside. It's always a kind of rupture, or it's always a kind of intervention that I did not call for and I did not call upon. And the sort of revolutionary dimension of that, the way that I see that, and this is something that we're looking at in the Logic of Sense reading group, is that this unannounced or unheralded transformation that comes with the event brings about a set of conditions that calls upon us to transform in a way. Perhaps it seems that we're not ready, or maybe it's that we're holding on to a certain conception of ourselves, our community, and so forth, and we're just simply not ready to let go. I mean, this can happen at the level of an interpersonal relationship, or it could happen at the level of a country. To maintain some fidelity to Deleuze here, that transformative impulse accesses within us an inchoate or a sort of undeveloped kernel of a becoming. An intuition is the word that he uses in the Logic of Sense, that if we allow that transformation, if we let it in, then at least for a moment, we can experience ourselves outside of the ways in which we ordinarily know ourselves. I mean, just going back to the example about the primatologist, just imagining her situation where when the grandmother chimpanzee takes a hold of her hands, there's a break there, right? Something happens. It comes fraught with doubts, uncertainties, a little bit of surprise, maybe even a little bit of excitement too. When we think about the politics of the weird or the metapolitics of the weird, that might be one of the starting points. What are those things that create that brief moment of lapse, a little insertion of something other than to what we're ordinarily familiar with, to get us to interrogate our attachments? And look, like if we're looking at it in Deleuze-Guattarian terms, there are times where we're revolutionary and there are times when we ourselves are reactionary in any given instance in our life. And so, I mean, I don't want to say it's just these people over here or just those people over there who have this experience. But in those experiences where we sort of scramble to recover some semblance of the solidity, even if that means going further beyond than what we ordinarily understood ourselves to be or how we ordinarily understand ourselves to be solid, that, I think, is the sort of microdynamics of being seduced by reactionary tendencies, is that increase in the tendency to reach for the solid rather than finding, and look, sometimes that solidity is a necessary condition for survival, right? I'm totally speaking in the abstract here, but I would say in other instances, it's that lapse in the solidity that allows us to see our vulnerability, the vulnerability of others, the needs of others. Sometimes it's our own will to be solid in our own way, which prevents us from seeing the needs of other. And it creates a kind of social unconscious where we don't know about the other because of the imposed demands of our personal subjectivity.
Yes, this is uncannily picking up on a number of themes that we explored in the Acid Communism course. It actually makes for a real segue into talking about that if we want to.
Let's do it, yeah.
I mean, I do want to briefly say that I'm also really committed to this idea of the gap as being something that we need to be deliberate about, that we need to be aware of, that in certain contexts, and I'll use academia as an example. It's becoming a bit of a punching bag for me, but it practices, ways of thinking, ways of seeing, ways of doing become so overcoded and overdetermined that any gap that was there, any capacity for lapse or just a break that allows for the intrusion of the new in a way that could not be predetermined or prestated, it might be there, but then it becomes sedimented under all of this other stuff so that you can't access it anymore. You can't feel it. You can't see it. This happens to people in their in their lives, in their relationships. Obviously, if this is all a bit abstract, it's because this framework maps onto pretty much everything. You can have micro revolutions that pertain to your relationships, and then nations, entire regions of the world go through macro revolutions, but it starts with a changing of consciousness and a changing of the guard. So there's people's minds changing, and also the official state of things changes. That none of that is possible if we're already in a full-on totalitarian state where everything has already been predetermined, where the rules have become so deeply enshrined, so deeply concrete, that even though they started out as abstractions, now we take them as concrete reality. We can't see anything beyond them. And I also think that it's helpful not to think of it as we have to be revolutionaries all the time, always be dwelling in the gap, always be opening up gaps for others, because then you fall into madness. Then you get chaos.
Or at the very least, you just get tired.
It's exhausting. Yeah, I mean, it's not good. It's not good at the micro or macro level. I mean, I think this is getting into maybe truly woo territory, but I don't mind. I mean, I do think of it as a yin and a yang, and a metaphysics of duality, basically. You need the reactionary side on one level. You need the revolutionary side on another. As it is with the current moment that we're in, which goes back now generations, it's far too easy for the reactionary side to transform into a far-right fascist, or even just still quite oppressive free market capitalism state of things. So that's why I suppose in the circles that we run in, the revolutionary gap side seems to be the way to go, because it's more politically expedient to be holding that line than the reactionary line. But in a very different world, I would be just as inclined to say, don't shake things up too much. Don't always be looking to revolutionize, because consistency, stability matters too. So,
I mean, I definitely agree. And today I'm going really hard in the paint as a Deleuze-Guattarian, whereas I'll don different masks in different discussions. But I think this was a caution that was elevated in A Thousand Plateaus, is that you do need to have just a little bit of a toehold on some strata just to get back to the prospect of doing anything revolutionary at all. I'm curious, by the way, since you just finished your course on acid communism, what are some things that came out of that you thought were best? What were highlights, or maybe insights that you had along the way, or maybe the way that I tend to remember classes are in terms of interesting turns of phrases or things that were said in the context of a discussion?
The absolute best was what the students brought to it. And I knew that would be the case before I knew who had registered or how many participants we would have. I had no way of knowing in advance just where the conversation would go. For 3 of the 4 sessions, I had slides that I showed, and the very last slide had prompts for discussion. The first session didn't include that at all, though, and we still had a very, very lively, very participant-driven conversation after the lecture portion. And what really sticks out to me is how the participants were making connections, not just between the texts that were assigned in the specific weeks, but between the weeks, and also bringing in material from outside of the course in a way that worked really, really well on the level of content, because they were finding things that were directly germane to what we were talking about. But there was an extension of Fisher's methodology that I think many of them were kind of aware that they were doing. And let me be a little bit more specific here. Fisher was very interested in looking at popular culture and really what was going on outside of the academy, what was going on with music in particular, with film, just kind of with affects of the day. He has a lot of writings where he talks about what it's just like to work with students in the year 2006, or just how people kind of seem. So very much bringing in real life as people actually live it, and what they're feeling and what kinds of media they're absorbing, and making that a real focus for his critical analysis. And not presuming that just because we're not all familiar with the context of like this one film or this one book or so on, that we can't all have a discussion about it, and presenting culture and just everyday life in a way that might seem sort of fragmented or piecemeal to other sensibilities. That was sort of happening in the course. One of the students created a letterboxed list. So letterboxed is, I think it's social media for film buffs, where people can just build up like playlists of films and be social through that shared interest. They created a letterboxed list of all of the films that were mentioned in The Weird and the Eerie, which is one of our main texts, including in the chapters that were not assigned. So we're really like doing their research, and people kept bringing in articles and making references that I think there is a part of me that would have wanted to step back and say, well, now like make sure you're giving enough context for everybody else and present this in its proper context. But this is happening in the chats that I can't moderate because I'm there giving a lecture or responding to something during the discussion section. So like while I'm talking, people are talking in the chat and like throwing links in, and then we set up things in the Google Classroom site. So it was good that I don't have total control over it. And it felt like the course became an archive, essentially, like a living document that was a mirror on culture that to me felt a lot like the mirror of cultures that Fisher kept casting throughout his career. And that's because of who showed up. It's the students.
If you remember, can you actually grab that letterbox list and pop it into the Discord channel? Yeah, so by the way, I know that many of the people who listen to this and are subscribed to this channel are also patrons on Acid Horizon. We now have channels for all of the AHRC classes in there. And so going forward, if you're in a class, and I haven't announced this yet, but basically, if you've attended a class, you will be in the Discord forever now. So you don't have to be a patron after that just to participate in the Discord on Acid Horizon. So that's good. And really, the only reason that we did that was to keep out trolls and things like that, which actually worked pretty well for the past few years since having it. Well, that's cool. I guess, I mean, we haven't talked about when the next time that you'll do a course is. I'm sure we will, but do you have an idea of what you might do next if given an opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, well, this is really the part where I will remind listeners that we have no script for this recording. So I'm about to share an idea that Sereptie has not yet heard. I have lots of ideas for different types of courses I'd like to teach. I am very interested in exploring the literature that some call anti-civ. I think there are good reasons to be skeptical of that term. That's anti-civilization. That intersects a lot with literature on anarchism and what I consider to be basically first principles technology criticism, where you're going all the way down to thinking very deeply, very structurally about what technology is, what industrialization, innovation, progress is, and why it would be that some people have written long tomes, very theoretical tomes in certain cases, critiquing this idea pretty much as such. So I'm thinking about an example of a first principles tech critic would be Jacques Ellul, who I would love to teach a course where we get to read The Technological Society and speak about Ellul deeply.
I'm about halfway through that audiobook right now.
Cool. Yeah. Zerzan, Rosick. There is a lesser known, I would put her in the anti-civ discourse. She's not very theoretical per se, but she's a good writer. Cellist Glendinning. There are a number of voices. And would want to frame it also around the critical questions and arguments that are always leveled at this discourse. First of all, there's a strong sense that to some degree I share that there's ableism, classism, racism that runs throughout some of these. That's very usually implicit, sometimes a little bit more explicit. Obviously don't want to foothold anybody who's doing that to a certain degree, and all sorts of other criticisms that can be leveled at this discourse. But so many people are interested in it right now. It's sort of like vaguely in like the prepper world too. I hate the term primitivism, but like that comes to bear on it. So to really give a lot of context for that, and not all come in saying like, we hate technology, we're Luddites, we hate progress, we hate cities at all, but to just have the conversations that I'm not seeing happening anywhere else. So that would be one example. Of course, I'd love to teach. And
before you go on to the next course,
sure.
I want to show you something. Hold on. Oh, there it is. So a former Penn State professor recently passed away, and he had about 3,000 books that they took down to the local used bookstore, and they're not all priced and everything yet. Needless to say, I dropped a dime on a couple of them already, and I picked up a book yesterday. I've only paged through it, but it's actually called The Idea of Wilderness by Max Olschlager. I mean, this is not an area of research that I'm particularly interested in, but I mean, back in the day, I read John Zerzan and all that stuff. And especially when you're just getting into anarchism or something like that, you want to find out like where you kind of map on, like where you are on the anarchist spectrum. But given that I do live in the woods, it's been a sort of philosophical question that I've had myself for a while, is how to conceptualize the space of the non-human, especially against the word wilderness, which is kind of overladen with perhaps a lot of 19th century connotations, and maybe even prior to that as well. But I don't know. Have you heard of this author? No?
Yeah, no, it seems interesting. And
it's a tome too. It's like 500 pages.
Many of these anti-civ and anti-civ adjacent books are like, they're like big books. Like these are
you have to cut down a lot of trees just to make the book. It's kind of ironic.
Right. Someone who I might assign, this actually just occurs to me, if I were running a class, is my former mentor, Tim Luke, who he wrote a very interesting essay on Ted Kaczynski, who is not somebody I would ever want to take seriously for obvious reasons. But I would need to, this is not an area that I would ever position myself as having special expertise in. Partially, I want the opportunity to dive into that world myself. The only other, the 10,000 gazillion ideas for courses and things that I want to do, but one other one that I feel quite passionately about is a course on friendship. And friendship.
Oh, nice.
In the age of technology, and how deeply and profoundly commodified our notions of friendship have become. And I have this folk theory about how most of us can't really wrap our heads around just how much damage has been done to the social in the last few decades, into the mid-20th century, maybe. I want to read Todd May's book, Friendship in an Age of Economics. I believe he's an anarchist philosopher who's written about the environment. Aristotle's writings. There's so much content out there. And I can't think of a better way to start reading about friendship than in the social context of a course where you have other people to share these ideas with and to make with, So yeah, that would be fantastic.
Cool. Super exciting. I forget what else was on the agenda. Oh, there is one more thing that I wanted to wrap with you about and kind of get your feedback on. And then if you have anything else, feel free to add it at the end. But I recently spoke with Nicholas DeWarren, who's a good friend of mine now and a Penn State professor. He's been on the Acid Horizon podcast maybe 3 or 4 times now, maybe 5 actually, because I I hosted some videos for him as well. But we catch up like every 4 months or so, and then we get like a little project going. So actually, one of the things that we'll be doing at the end of February, beginning of March, I imagine, is there is a new translation of Gunther Anders' The Obsolescence of the Human. And I think it's out on University of Minnesota Press. They sent me a copy of it. And actually, I found the name of the scholar. It's in the book hall. It's back there. Christopher Muller, I believe his name is. I'm sorry if I got the name wrong. I know his first name is Chris. But he did the translation. But he also has a book where he does a few sort of exegetical essays. And that's somebody we don't hear a lot about in the Anglophone world, more popular in Europe, as I understand it. And I'm just getting into the work, the notion of Promethean guilt, right? That we have created these machines. We've created this massive technological edifice. And now we have this sense of shame about the thing that we have made. A fascinating discussion is on the way, to say the least. But amidst all of that, Nicholas is a true mensch and comrade and friend, in the sense that he understands what we're trying to do with Acid Horizon Research Commons, and he's going to be teaching a course. So we will have a tenured Penn State professor teaching a course, probably on philosophy and science fiction, sometimes in the summer. And we were just talking about ideas like, how can we expand philosophy? Like, everybody's kind of on this mission in the space that we're working in right now. How can we not only just do philosophy in different ways, but really overcome many of the obstacles, both politically, economically, socially, that we see as being impediments to the discipline? And I mean, this isn't a completely novel idea, but and I tried looking for it online. I couldn't find it, but there's a liberal arts professor at some college. So what this teacher did, whoever it was that on the weekends, he would have things like a read-in. So imagine you come in the morning, you occupy a building or a space, and then everybody takes up roost in like one room or in this corner over here. And they set the timer or whatever. And they're like, okay, 2 hours sustained silent reading, and then we're going to break for lunch. After lunch, people get in the circle and maybe do a little bit of a read aloud, or they pick on some parts of the book that they found were interesting. And the whole weekend or the day is conducted in a way, and maybe I'm just adding this in, but I think this was the case, that like there were no phones, there were no notes, there were no scaffolds or anything like that, unless maybe somebody absolutely needed an accommodation. But I mean, that's something that I kind of, dreamed up on my own. I have this sort of interpassive relationship with this idea of like, almost like a little philosophy summer camp away from all the technology. And we just sit down and we just read in a day. And we starve that part of ourselves that craves the digital, and we take vengeance on it. And it's a very holy vengeance, in which at the end of the Saturday or Sunday, we've made it through a fair chunk of the Dialectic of Enlightenment or whatever book that we've chosen for that particular reading. And we've had a very nourishing, fruitful interaction with people that we call friends, or will start to call friends. And it becomes like a full-blown trad interaction of sorts. To me, that there's something quite appealing about that. And that's something that's not impossible to organize locally. I think the people who really need it most are the people where you're at, like in the cities and stuff, people who can't easily escape the noise or the distractions, or as easily. And so that's something that I'm thinking about doing, and doing it, of course, either absolutely free of charge, except that I would love to reserve a space. And where I live, being close to the university, I know it's possible to get grants or just source funds from friends. Like, if we want to rent this fancy church space, we can do it. We all just chip in $60 or whatever, and we'll get it for the weekend. But not only that, like, what if, okay, we have some people who make lunch, and some people are going to do dinner or something like that. And then it's kind of organized so that we really create, talking about gaps or caesaras or lacunae or any of those terms, like you really create an intervention into the sort of mundane digital flow that we're all inured to right now. And I don't know, what do you think? Have you heard of anybody even attempting something like this? I know that the St. John's College does something quite like this, but
That doesn't surprise me, knowing the little that I know about St. John's. I have heard of something in this field somewhat. It's not exactly what you're describing, but a few years ago, I received a call for papers for a conference on environmental philosophy that was being organized as a, a camp out. So everybody would be camping. They would come with tents, and everything was going to be done outside in June. I think in Pennsylvania, actually. I remember getting the CFP when I was living and teaching on the outskirts of Philadelphia, and it was to be held somewhere in central PA. And I just wanted to participate so badly, but there was no way that I could massage my research to fit the theme of environmental philosophy, just because I thought it would be fun to go camp out and then give a talk, like an academic conference talk while sitting under a tree, and everyone's in like cargo shorts and like laid out on blankets and towels and stuff, as cool as that sounded. But I mean, something like what you're describing, that is like my dream event. I am a very reluctant urbanite. I deeply resent the fact that I don't live on the top of a mountain, and I have to live in New York City out of circumstance. But whether it's held in the woods or not, a really important component of this would be weaning people off their devices. And I mean, I try so hard to put boundaries around that, just so that I have the capacity to read and think deeply. It's so strange, because being an online scholar, a person who's doing scholarly work in this very public way, where I have to be online all the time, is at odds with the mindset that one needs to actually be able to read and process at a certain level. So yeah, I would say it sounds amazing, and it sounds necessary, frankly, to have events like these. The whole commune side of things, where people would be cooking lunch, dinner, that's not only helpful from an accessibility, like a financial accessibility perspective, but it will shore up a sense of community. It will bring something back to the educational experience that I think actually used to be a bit more common, a certain communal feeling. I'm very, very interested in my big picture thoughts about pedagogy. My ideal educational experience is one where people are cooking and eating together, in addition to just discussing great texts. They're also washing the dishes together too.
when I went to the Wilhelm Reich Museum in Rangeley, Maine, the coordinator there, David Silver is his name, he mentioned that they are actually building cabins and like a tent area where they plan to hold events. I mean, basically use the grounds for all kinds of event, like just campouts, I guess, or people like Airbnb, perhaps. I don't know. But their facility also has like a kitchen and stuff. And I did float the idea, oh, wouldn't it be cool if, and I told him something like I suggested here. And he seemed all about it at the time. And that's a nice place too, especially if you're from New York. It's not very hard to get to Rangeley, Maine. What is it? 4 hours, 4.5 hours, something like that. And then where I'm located, there's just tons of places. We do have plenty of rentable spaces. And not only that, just local community centers that are more, like I know, for example, my friend Kevin, who is a composer and he's a professor of music at Penn State. He works a lot with this community model, and he's a little bit further along, I would say, than us in terms of the kinds of events that he's produced and the sort of encounters that he's facilitated. But out in a town near here that probably doesn't get many shout outs, a town called Aaronsburg that has a predominantly Amish population has a community center like fully fit with a kitchen and everything. And I know that they go over there and they do little concerts and things like that at a very small scale. And the ethos is driven by one of the things that he seems to be intent upon is avoiding the traps of the NGO industrial complex and not taking a whole bunch of money to pump it into an event that, I don't know, maybe 13 to 30 people will show up to. And maybe you get a lot of money for it, but doing the kinds of events like, well, if nobody shows up, then nobody wanted it. Right.
Yeah.
So part of the community investment is actually doing it and not, we use the word astroturf to mean a certain thing, but there's a way in which grant monies, when they get fired at a certain kind of event, there is an air of inauthenticity about it. Whereas if it's just like 13 or 14 people doing a potluck or doing something for the event or doing a performance or a talk at an equal level of investment or a comparable level of investment anyway, then not only does it feel more community driven, there's less excess and waste at the level of like, well, too much money was dumped into that.
Yeah. That's a very good point. And I think there's an appetite right now for grassroots works, just anything from one-off events to things that have greater duration in time that are not sponsored by institutions because, of the times that we're in, all institutions seem to be crumbling and there's just a huge level of mistrust for good reason in the traditional vectors for funding and administering these kinds of things. And the more that people can kind of like just do things, just get things off the ground on their own, speaking of anarchism, just understand the power of the bottom up and the collective. I think in this political moment in particular, there's just something that's really empowering and uplifting about that. It's whenever people can prove to themselves that the same structures that have been making life terrible for so many people are not strictly necessary for us to have beautiful things. I think that feels really good to those participating, and it sends a powerful message.
Yeah. Maybe the last thing that I'll say in this recording, I'll let you have the last word for sure, but the sort of moniker or banner that I want to put on this is something like, we need to create, well, I don't want to impose necessity or obligation on it, but wouldn't it be nice if we created vacuoles of non-communication as a mode of resistance in conjunction with like being in ICE's face on the street, right? Where the resistance that comes from creating these spaces is about getting dislodged from, I mean, let's face it, I'm on Twitter and I mean, I'm not only inured to the effects of Twitter, but I am addicted to it. Like I'm contaminated. And like I will fight. Like I'm mostly reticent these days, but I will pick up a sword and shield for some issues and go to battle with people or what have you. But everything there is just an absolute circus these days. And it's not even just the outrage. It's the AI images, it's the pornography, it's everything. And there's really no way to avoid it. And they've even done this new thing on Twitter now, like where you post an image in 4 pieces so that the way that you see it is you click on it and then the image stacks. And you see what essentially is a degraded form of the image because there's separations. You don't see it as a contiguous image. So what was the point? And there's just something insidious, like there's a very insidious form of psychological control there that gets you to click something, to see something that's essentially of an inferior quality to what could in fact be there, which is a full, complete picture rather than like 4 disjoint puzzle pieces. It's really strange. But that's the least of it, as I'm saying. And then with the Epstein files and everything that we're seeing right now, it's just an utter circus in there. And I'm part of it. And I'm castigating Noam Chomsky and everybody else right now who's involved with that. And it's just a sign of the times. But that said, I have this split within myself too, where in my more private and quiet moments, I do want to retreat to that space. I do want to achieve the sort of nourishment that one has separated from these devices. Because let's face it, like you said, I mean, I work online, so I'm shoulder to shoulder with these apparatuses, at least for 12 hours a day or more.
The pressure to self-exploit by constantly posting, by feeling the need to share and sharing and posting as the default rather than keeping something in as the default. Something I've felt very strongly about for a number of years. And I've spoken about this in other episodes, and I've written about it. It's part of the reason why I initially chose an academic career rather than a more public-facing one. So I am very gung-ho about non-communication as a form of resistance. And I think it makes sense to think of being very deliberate about non-communication and very deliberate about communication, bringing a lot of intention both to the retreat and the advance. Everyone has to define for themselves, what does it mean for me to be a public-facing person right now? Here in New York City, for a lot of the people I know, that means going to anti-ICE trainings, going out very literally into the streets, because that is a good way to do things, that not everyone lives in a big city. Being intentional about what your relationship is with social media in these times. But just as much, I mean, creating spaces for collective retreat and collective inwardness. I don't just think it's a nice idea. I think it's necessary for us to continue to have the energy to keep fighting and keep creating beautiful things. So yes. I mean, I think really the last thing that I would want to say that wraps up a lot of what we've touched on today is that everybody who has participated in the kinds of things that we're both trying to do as public-facing scholars, educators, content creators, whether you're doing that kind of thing yourself, you're on the creation side, whether you're a participant or you want to support it administratively or even just by giving money to it, there is so much interest, so much energy, and so much goodwill around these kinds of things right now. I mean, I know personally a lot of spaces, physical spaces, plots of land where people want to host the kind of event that you were just talking about. I know of a number that are just in the Hudson Valley, my home region. I know of spaces on the West Coast in New Mexico. It seems like so many people are converging on the need for this kind of thing right now, whether we want to call it or stuff it fully under the umbrella of para-academia. The weird side of things is part of it, but it's not all of it. And I would just say to everyone who's showed up, that's great. Please keep doing it. We need more people who are like-minded. And to those who are interested, all of this stuff is very grassroots, and it's not too late to find your way in, whether it's through a Discord server or by signing up for a class as a student or starting to put yourself out there as a scholar. And I don't get paid to say these things. I'm not representing one particular project or another, but just a whole ecosystem right now that I think is still in its early days. So we need more people. That's basically it.
I'm imagining ourselves as like roving troubadours, like in a little horse-drawn carriage. But when we get out, we just create silence everywhere. And reading, quiet and reading. Well, next time we get together, we're going to have Phil Ford on the show to talk about the aesthetics and politics, but in a very different way, on Richard Wagner. So, I mean, Phil's just a great speaker and an esteemed avuncular colleague. So we're looking forward to having him. So we'll see you next time.